They said the house began to glow from inside, as if the flames had started not in wood or oil, but in memory itself. A February night in 1939, low clouds on the Essex horizon, frost feathering the hedges along a sleepy lane, villagers standing in their coats across the road, as the rectory, their rectory, kindled to life in a way no hearth should. The long, awkward building, with its mismatched gables and blind windows, went the color of an ember. Glass cracked, slate sighed. Somewhere a bell, no one could agree which bell, rang once and fell silent, a sleeve tugged by invisible fingers. They did not know yet the right names to whisper. They didn't know the stories, as headlines, just as rumor. But the longer they watched, the darker the faces in the crowd grew, and someone said it, the word that didn't belong to fires or insurance or parish lists. None. Captain W.H. Gregson, an ex-soldier who had come to Borley with practical plans and a taste for improvement, had been moving things earlier that evening, shifting boxes in the hall, the clatter of a house that had never learned to be still. An oil lamp tipped. He swore he said it right. Later he would insist he had. But fire doesn't wait for certainty. Flame licked at the banister like a tongue. The long corridor became a rifle barrel of heat. Children were hustled out. Between the blasts of cold air at the doors and the furnace behind them, voices went fast and high. Someone said they saw her in the upstairs window once, just for a second. The curved outline of a woman in a dark wimple, as calm as a portrait on a wall. In the orange bloom, dust turned to glitter. Smoke lifted old bloodless smells. Chalk, mildew, hymnals. In the waver of heat was the memory of other winters, other owners, a line of clergy who had given sermons about endurance and patience and the small daily chores of salvation. For 70 years, the rectory had stood here on a patch of ground that had been ground to something else before it, a farm kitchen, a medieval holding, a rumor of monastic stones. The old men said, a priory. The genealogists said, no proof, but stories prefer the unresolved. They keep air in a myth the way lungs keep air in a body. Back through frost and across decades, we move with the breath of it. The house began in 1862, when Reverend Henry Dawson, Ellis Bull, stood where the hedgerow cleaves and imagined brick and dark red tile. He wanted room for a large family, for servants, for the parish's business and its people. It rose long and narrow, with more windows than a small congregation would ever need. The walls held warmth poorly. The corridors gave children a place to run, a place for sound to carry and die. They said the Bull children first gave the shape its ghost. They drew the same woman again and again in chalk on scraps, veils, solemn eyes. They traced her, walking along the garden's edge, where a gravel path pressed the lawn like a seam. The eldest girls called it the Nun's Walk. Long before any other story set in, skeptics would later run their fingers over the seams in these telling, saying, the house taught them. The bells on cords from the servants' quarters pinged and quivered when no hand touched them, because wood contracts and expands at night, because rats travel the hidden runs behind plaster, because children like a story with a live animal in it. But at dusk, it's hard to measure anything. The sky collapses on the flint boundary wall with a sound too soft to time. People saw what they saw. Reverend Bull died in 1892, and his son, Reverend Harry Foyster Bull, took the gown and study. If the house shook, he didn't write it down. A man who held his parish to routines. The clatter of the kitchen began at dawn. The narrow stair groaned. Out in the garden, behind the figs, behind the wirework seats, he would sometimes pause and look toward the edge of the lawn, as if listening for a foot he'd trained himself to ignore. A coach was said to move on invisible wheels down the lane, hooves on hard ground you could count. If anyone asked Harry, he would smile and say there were better things to pray for. Time drew a thin film over the old rumors. Harry Bull died in 1927. The rectory sat with its shuttered windows, sifting light like flour. A newer rector, the Reverend Guy Eric Smith, arrived in 1928 with his wife Mabel, practical people who had inherited, along with the job and the house, a local myth. The first days were busy and ordinary. The flue smoked. A cat learned the geography. A seam of damp reappeared in the blue room upstairs. Then one afternoon, while Mabel knelt in the garden, doing what she called real work, weeding along the nun's walk, her hand closed on cold grit and lift, bones, a skull with a broken smile, earth packed in its nostrils. She froze. Then, with all the reflex of a decade in parish life, she fetched her husband. There were explanations. The rectory had a history. The land had been turned for centuries. Nothing stays where it starts underground. They set the bones aside with a care that felt like penance. That night, the first bell rang. It ran like a child. One clang, then two, then silence, the rope trembling where it disappeared above a door frame into the hidden hollows of the house. Eric Smith stood beneath it, with his head tilted, and listened to a coldness you can't throw a body around. The next day, footsteps ran the corridor when no one was in it, and a glass hit the floor without falling first. The house exhaled, and the rooms went shallow. They were rational, both of them. They spoke to neighbors, and were told what everyone told everyone. It's a strange house, that's all. You'll get used to it. But the low rumble in Mabel's blood didn't ease. In June 1929, under the polite shock of another sleepless night, they did what people in modern times do. They went to the press. A letter to a London paper. Not a confession. Not an invitation to hysteria. A request for help, couched in grammar. The Daily Mirror sent a reporter and a camera, and to the rectory's doorstep, another man whose name would tie itself to the building's secrecy, the way ivy ties to brick, Harry Price. On the evening the car crunched to a stop, and the headlamps lit the steel shine of the gate, the house gave itself to the night, as if it could open further. A knock on wood. Mabel touched her husband's sleeve, without meaning to. The door opened. Not a living soul on the step yet, just the spill of fog around the man with the case, and the quick intelligence of a stage magician's face. And behind him, the reporter with his notebook already open. At that same instant, from somewhere deep in the rectory, a bell rang the briefest astonished note, and stopped. The leather case touched the threshold, and the air changed, as if an unspoken dare had been made, and the house understood it. Harry Price's bow was quick, almost joking, and then he was inside, dropping his hat onto a chair, asking where the disturbances had been, worst with the ease of someone remembering an address, rather than finding it for the first time. The mirror man hovered behind, his pencil hunting for the first vivid phrase. He would find it soon enough. The rectory seemed determined to provide. Two things happened in those first days of June 1929. The phenomena increased, and they became more theatrical. Stones fell from nowhere into the reporter's feet. A vase lifted as if to offer itself in demonstration, and then tipped, hitting the floor with the irregular logic of a dream. footsteps converged on closed doors and receded before the latch could lift. In what became a grim joke inside the house, the servants' bells rang in pairs, as if brothers or sisters calling each other across the corridors. Price did what he always did. He marked floors with chalk, sprinkled talc across thresholds to catch invisible feet, put his palm out to feel the change in temperature that sometimes precedes belief. There is a photograph from that week, one of many, that shows a brick midair in the passageway, a blur. He did not take it. The mirror's man did, or someone with a magazine sense of the value of a thrown object. Price's presence, the skeptical would argue later, had a way of lifting things that light hands can lift. The Smiths didn't say this. They stood beside their belief like it was a nervous horse. When the house rocked, they steadied themselves with talk and tea. Whatever was in the walls obeyed stranger physics during those days. A bottle left in a pantry arrived smashed in a bedroom. A gentle scratching skittered across the back of a chair, and then, impossibly, across the inside of a plaster wall. The cat arched, hissed the kind of sibilant refusal a creature makes when every hair is its own warning, and bolted. Mabel found it 3 hours later, under a bed with its fur salted with cobweb. Price stayed a short time only. He had other engagements. The mirror had its story, and the Smiths had a house that had learned to perform. By autumn, the rectory saw many visitors and found no peace. Reverend Smith, exhausted, resigned. It is the simplest fact. Houses are only houses until they have exhausted the people in them. The parish did not stay empty long. In October 1930, a new rector arrived, Reverend Lionel Algernon Foyster, and with him his much younger wife, Marianne, with a crooked smile and a step that looked like it could accelerate or pause at will. They brought a small child, Adelaide, into a place that had pretended to be a home for generations. Lionel, a mild man with a bookish tilt, came as many clergy do, full of lists and hopes for economies and better habits. He would keep a diary, because he always had. He would make the blue room a study. He would invent a routine, and the house would submit. The first weeks gave him the illusion of success. The old rooms arranged themselves to their new owners. Marianne warmed the kitchen. By force of will, she hung photographs and pinned shopping lists to the pantry door. Lionel adjusted his collar and strolled the garden, eyes on the hedges that wanted trimming and the lawn that needed leveling. He paused at the path where local women said a nun walked at dusk, and he laughed the low, embarrassed laugh of a man who wants to believe nothing requires his fear. The bells began again. They rang in ways that looked personal. Lionel listened, and then wrote what he heard in his pocketbook. Time, length, coincidences. When the blue room punched a chill into his chest, he stood there longer to test it. A stone hopped in the corridor, as if kicked by a child, and struck his ankle. A trick of floorboard? He put his weight on it. It did not move. Marianne, who had the instincts of someone raised to endure without speaking too large about it, began taking the long way round the landing. A coldness walked there, a hurrying, soundless mash of shapes that felt like people half convinced they are people. She said nothing until she had to. The night she woke to a whisper she thought was Lionel S., and the sinking realization that it came from behind the dressing table, where there was no place a voice could stand. The whisper said her name. It came again in daylight. She was alone, or thought she was, in the hallway when a pencil laid on a shelf moved slightly, and then the slight movement became the poor scrawl of a child, and the child's scrawl became handwriting, so clumsy it was almost too legible. Marianne. She stared at the half letter like a woman who has seen her name on a telegram before she's expected one. She reached toward it, and the pencil stopped. She waited, and it dragged again, slowly, the grinding noise of graphite on plaster. She heard it in her teeth. Lionel did not doubt her, because he did not want to live in a life that asked him to. He hung paper over the graffitied panel and found, behind it, no scrapes. The next day, on another wall entirely, a new line appeared. Marianne, please help me. It was bad handwriting, but careful, slow. The words persuaded nothing. They made no sense. How does a woman help a wall? He prayed. Of course he did. When the words came, again, light mass prayers, and please do not, it was like watching a child learn a language badly. It was also like being taunted. The house began to throw. A mirror lifted from its nail and turned as if to catch her expression. A book shot its pages like a bird. Marianne took blows from hands she could not see. A friend visiting the rectory caught a slap that registered not only in shock, but in the clear bloom of skin left behind. Lionel tried to perform an exorcism with his own voice. It failed. The bells rang the way a mouth laughs. He felt, for the first time in his life, that his faith had become smaller than a place, and that place was his own house. He wrote in his diary, not just for himself now, but for a recorder, a future reader, anyone who would lay this all out and make it arithmetic. The events added themselves up, nonetheless. A bed slid after midnight with the weight of two men. A larder lock turned itself. Hands he could not see tore a calendar from the wall and put the torn days into the sugar bowl. On a morning gray with rain, Marianne was lifted and thrown across a room with such force she landed on her shoulder and lay looking at the pattern in the carpet, because the pattern was the only thing that didn't cue to argue with her. The message on the wall grew neater. Help me, Marianne. The pencil had been left elsewhere. The child's scrawl had learned how to use its lines. She stood in the corridor, breathing as quietly as a 1-second sleep, and watched the last loop of the E be written by no hand. It trailed in the plaster like a finger passing over water, and she felt something focused on her in the worst possible way. A concentration without a face. When Lionel rounded the corner, still buttoning a cuff, he saw her standing there, and saw the writing, and stepped, not toward his wife, but toward the words they were supposed to answer. The pencil lifted again, as if a thought had risen across rooms to demand another breath of living. The scratching began, deliberate, and Marianne, without meaning to, said out loud to a thing she could not name, "What do you want?" The pencil stopped, hung for a half-second, and then returned to the wall as though a child's hand, guided by someone older, had grabbed it and forced it to confess. The words came as if climbing out of a well. It will not let me rest. They scratched across the faded paint, and the room turned into a lung that had forgotten how to exhale. Marianne backed away and hit the chest of drawers, the wood refusing to forgive the jolt. Lionel stood where he was for too long, his priest's instincts dividing like cells. Comfort your wife, call for help, hold your ground, interrogate, bless, flee. He did none of these swiftly enough, because in houses like this time becomes thick, and every step seems to stick. The wall went quiet. The pencil fell from its small height and clattered on the floor with the absolute certainty of ordinary things. Outside, across the garden, a wind moved through the thin line of trees and lifted the last dry leaves into an embarrassed flight. The day continued in the village, as if here there were not words in a corridor, making a woman sway, as if her knees were not hers. What is the breaking point in any house? It's not the loudest thing, it is the accumulation of details, until any one of them is the pebble that makes the avalanche. Lionel began sleeping badly and calling it sleep. Marianne began moving objects very slightly before she left rooms, the way you do when you're testing whether the next act is trickery or revelation, and the house obliged in both directions. Cups changed places, pens vanished. A pair of scissors unhooked itself from a nail and appeared, pointed and unrepentant, at the bottom of a child's toy basket. A coat on a peg swung and stopped, as if someone with poor control of their limbs had tried to pull it down and failed. One night, their slow exorcism, the household version of it, the clinging to habit, the refusal to name fear with full energy, failed outright. Lionel stood in the blue room with his book of common prayer, a candle guttering, and a voice that knew how to make cadence. "Defend us," he said into the air, and a small framed photograph lifted off the dressing table and hit him squarely on the wrist with a speed that mocked his vocabulary. The candle guttered sideways, spitting wax. A bell rang elsewhere in the house, as if someone in another room had called for a servant. The corridor became movement. The words that had been on the wall for days began to fade, not as if the plaster itself was changing its mind, but as if water had moved through them and they were being washed down and away. Lionel stopped. Marianne drew a breath like the first breath you take after you realize you weren't breathing. He told her, in the dashed way you tell someone what you want very much to be true, that sometimes an exorcism works over hours. Sometimes it works over days. She nodded and stood in the doorway, as if the lintel could take some of her weight. The wall was only a wall again. For that night, there were witnesses. A carpenter saw a brick move along a floor with no hand to shove it. He left the house with a mouth that could not close all the way for a while, and told the story to his wife, as if telling it would put air back in his lungs. Visitors who had come for curiosity in the papers went away without anecdotes because they had seen things and did not want the work of putting them into sentences, not with their own names attached. A housemaid left and never sent for her last wages. Lionel wrote and wrote and wrote, and each entry tried to limit what had none. Then human life, with its old needs, pushed into whatever this was and complicated it. Marianne was not a saint. She was not a cartoon either. She was a young woman, married to an older, fragile man in a village where the sky is wide and the evenings long. There were men who carried crates on their shoulders, men who walked with a sureness that does not come from books, men who came to the rectory to fix a hinge or install a rail and found themselves in a room with a woman everyone said was being slapped by air. Later, much later, she would say she faked some of it. She would not say that what she faked was the sum of it. During those months, the phenomena that could be performed were performed. Water splashed where no jug had been moved, because hands, living hands, can move water where they will. There were notes hidden and found that made a paragraph when removed from hiding and read together. There were also undeniable objects in motion when no one was near them. How do you live in a place where the liar tells some truth and the truth tells some lies? The answer is, you grow thin with it. Lionel weakened, first with worry, and then with a more literal frailty that no bell could wring him out of. His health bent him. In 1935, the Foysters left the rectory, not like victors, and not like losers, but like people who had reached the edge of a field. They had been plowing endlessly, and realized it was not a field at all, only the place where the earth stopped pretending it had any work for them left to do. The house stood empty, the damp climbing the lower plaster. The place where the wall had borne people's fear now sponged blankly any sunlight that dared. When people cannot leave a problem alone, they medicalize it, or they professionalize it. Harry Price did the latter. In 1937, he negotiated the right to rent the rectory for a year. He filled it with observers. The summer vigil, he called it. 48 volunteers, mostly learned amateurs in tweed with good pens and excellent attention spans, came with notebooks and torches and the readiness to be wrong that some scientists wear as armor. Price did all the things he did: numbered objects, sealed some rooms with wax, scattered flour to catch footprints, recorded every sound as if the act of writing would shave the phenomena down to something you could weigh. Nights had the long blankness of someone listening for a heartbeat in a very old wall. Then, on a night after midnight, when the rain hit the glass, as if the house were a drum, one of the observers, a man named Sidney Glanville, felt the floor of the hall tremble at the exact cadence of cautious feet. He knelt quickly, laid his hand flat to the boards, and felt the rhythm move under the wood like a current. Far away, another observer noted, the smallest bell rang twice, and the rectangle of the landing window went black then light, as if someone had passed before it. The hunger in the room was not human hunger, and not a word for it that would look well in print later. There were sittings in the dining room with a planchette, the little wheeled pointer that people let their fingertips guide over letters to let their unconscious speak. It spelled names that grew steadily more certain, as if the group mind had learned pronunciation. Marie Lair, it wrote, a French nun from 1667 who had sinned and been punished, bricked up, hidden as shame. Scholars flinched at the neatness. They could find no record of such a priory in Borley, no archives to hold a nun named Marie Lair in a neat hand. The story had the quick sketch symmetry myth loves: a love affair with a monk, flight, execution by stone behind stone, and then, centuries later, scratching on a modern wall. The planchette also wrote something the group would value differently on a different night. It said there would be a fire, and after the fire, there would be a discovery. On the last cold evenings of 1938, Price's people walked the Nun's Walk at dusk like a penance. The path glowed with the last light. The hedges lifted their winter-stiff arms, and every footfall sounded exactly like itself, no more. In the cellars, with their damp and their fog of saltpeter and soft bricks, there were noises of the house settling, and then, once, something that was not settling, a scrabble like animal paws where no animal could fit, and the high, shocked exhale of the observer who heard it. Price's year ended, and the house exhaled its lease. It changed hands. The watchers packed away their notebooks like cigarettes after a long night. The planchette's prediction remained scribbled in someone's mind like a dare you make yourself in a mirror and pretend you did not. The rectory, mute, clocked another winter, the hedges grating under frost, the blue room keeping its stale chill as steady as faith. On an evening just before the end of February, under a sky that broke very low, a new owner struck a match with the ordinary sound of a man lighting his way. A very small rasp, as unmagical as anything that burns. From an upstairs landing came the unmistakable complaint of a board taking weight where no foot was meant to be. A bell, somewhere in the deep threads of the house, quivered. On a plastered wall, now stained with the years, something like a breath moved under paint, as if letters were reconsidering themselves, as if the act of writing was just a rehearsal for some larger enunciation. The lamp went, and with it the stairs. Oil ignites the way some stories do, eagerly, with no sense of the harm they're about to perform. The flame walked the grain of the banister, found the threads of dust, and the old beeswax, and the lint of towels, and put a quiet hand on everything. Captain Gregson shouted something practical that got lost in the friction of his own fear, and the first wail a child made in that house in years rose like a test. Downstairs, doors banged open to the outside, and winter air shouldered in as if it had a will. The house took the cold into itself and gave back heat unbothered. Fire learns a building fast. It learned the rectory, as if they had been speaking across years, in some secret language. Corridor, room, corridor, stair. The roof, with its bell of air, drew the flame up in a draft, and then made a chimney of the whole. A system. Floorboards cracked. Plaster bulged and frothed, where lath gave way behind it. The sound drove nails through recollection. Time, for those inside, fell into 4 pieces only. Get out, count who is out, go back if someone isn't, and watch. Outside, night had its crowd. A village draws together, for heat as much as awe. A man in a cap ran with a bucket, then realized what everyone realized. The pump, and a bucket, and the well-rehearsed charity of neighbors would not beat this. The first fire engine arrived hissing, its lamp turning the hedge into a stage. The finch-boned upper windows crackled. A woman crossed herself with a hand that looked like it had been carrying flour minutes before. The smell altered as curtains and carpet went. The sweet, wrong sugar of varnish came on fast. A wind pushed through and sent sparks up like a prayer no one wanted. Children always know where the edge is between seeing and telling. In the crowd, one boy did not blink. He pointed once, his arm stiff, and then sobbed convulsively and said he had seen her. Others said the same later. Memory unrolls evenly, only on paper. A figure at a window, caught in the frame. The illusion of movement across a square, shrinking with fire. A dark shape in a light made orange. What else would it be but a human-made saint by the angle of heat and the need to put meaning where neither oxygen nor wood owned any? In the garden, behind the flint, the nun's walk glowed in reflected furnace. Without a source, the path carried light like a lit fuse. The hedges threw lively shadows on the lawn. Monks, hunters, priests, lovers, and all of them ran in place. A fireman swore and ducked and then laughed, because something that had no business falling fell past his ear without touching him. A beam, a slate, and landed unaccountably gentle at his boot. Harry Price, had he been there, and not in London, would have noted the position, the lamplight's angle, the testimony. He was not. He would read the accounts, and then shape them with the muscle of his gift into a narrative that fit a life's work. Inside the ruin of the corridor, plaster showed its ancient skeleton, laths like ribs, licks of old reed. The blue room coughed flame and then surrendered its ceiling. The service bells, their ancient wires, long since broken, were warmed enough in their cold cradles to give one out-of-tune, solitary ring that carried across the garden and into the crowd, where a woman who had once delivered bread to that house ducked her head and said a name without sound. Captain Gregson came out blackened at the hands, his eyebrows singed, swearing with a soldier's economy. He would later tell the coroner that a lamp had been knocked, that he had set it right, that he had not left a flame where he shouldn't. He believed it. He also knew that fire tells its own version of events and leaves it in tracery only experts can read. The fire investigators would note scorches and vectors and say the light sentence, accidental. The prediction, that was real because it had been written down. Someone would read the planchette's words now with a thrill. After fire, a discovery. People kept half an eye on the cellar even as the roof went. The house, in its collapse, did not give it up. You do not dig bones while wood glows. You stand and watch your own breath and feel the cold at your back and the heat on your face and swear that you will never again make a house a container for any story but the one that works. At the very moment the last gable lifted and then settled with the sound of a sigh grown too large for a chest, a second engine pulled in, steam braiding with smoke. The hoses, in the end, did what human force does best. They contained. The ruin steamed and panted. The night reset itself by degrees. The village's eyes slowly returned to their sockets, the hands unclenched, the coats buttoned anew. If there were an apparition, it had been a line drawn in air by heat and hope. If there was something here that wanted something, it had found a better way to say it than chalk. In the weeks after, the rectory stood like a broken jaw. Its rooms were sky. The corridors went nowhere. Children dared each other to run the path at twilight and then lost their nerve at the first rustle in the hedges. Those with clipboards came. Harry Price came. He moved among the rubble with a dog and a walking stick, as if to demonstrate that he was both a gentleman and a scientist, both country and city. He whistled low and let the dog range ahead where the floor was safe. Its hackles rose in the cellar as if smell had hours. The prophecy worked, or someone made it work. In 1943, 4 slow years of war and rationing since the fire, 4 years of rumor accruing like soft mold in damp. Price and others dug in the cellar where the ground had a feel to it that made people think of old places, making room under new. They turned earth with shovels, and with their own superstition, they found bones. The word came quick and certain. A human jawbone, they said, of a young woman. He surrounded it with the kind of awe he understood better than he understood any liturgy. He lifted it lightly and gave it weight with words. Not everyone agreed. The local vicar balked at a burial for an identity created on wheels and letters. Later examiners would say the jaw might just as likely have been animal. Price had it interred anyway in a churchyard near, beneath a name gleaned from a seance. In 1944, the war obliging no one for sentiment, the remains of the rectory were knocked down with the blunt finality of a demolition crew. The last sections went with the non-drama of men who have work to complete. Bricks stacked, beams cut, hedges graded into the general hush, standing where a corridor had once made its long, deliberate proposition, "Walk me, and I will make you think you have heard someone else walking." Men smoked and felt simple on purpose, but some stayed until the light thinned the sun, flirting with the top of the flint wall, as if what was left of the house might finally let the last of its words go, and the garden path with its gravel and its weeds could be just a path again. On a late afternoon, long after the engines had gone, and the village had chosen its favorite version of the story, a man standing at the gate felt the soft, regular cadence of hooves on the lane, the right sound for a coach that wouldn't appear around the bend. He smiled at his own childishness and waited for the real cart and its real horse to arrive. It didn't. The sound went past him and up the air like a reminder of how the mind likes to complete a pattern when it has been told one exists. In London, ink dried. In the Society for Psychical Research, patients gathered and then fell off the table. In cottages along the Suffolk border, people said, "You know," and "It was in the papers," and "Poor Mrs. Foyster," and also, "Well, but," a story in smoke had made heat, and heat had made a wound in the landscape, and the wound had been sewn shut in time with demolition. An absence is easier to entertain. A ruin is a stage. Everyone was waiting for the last scene to begin, the one with a book and a verdict and a name hammered down like a nail. When Price sat at his desk, with his photographs arranged around him and his notes in full procession, the clock on his mantel made the quiet, decent sound clocks make. Through the window, the city argued itself in traffic. He wrote his title with a flourish that was absolutely itself. The most haunted house in England. In Borley, a low mist held to the ground where a building had been, and at the far edge of the former lawn, a fox crossed with the arrogance of animals who do not carry our stories. Needle quiet, unhaunted, the climax of a story about a house is always a story about what happens after the house is gone. From the disaster of flame and the thin-lipped patience of demolition, the narrative found its final pitch in paper. Harry Price published, and the rectory, ruin and rubble, and then flattened grass, rose again in sentences that lent shape to smolder. He wrote with flair. He wrote with a conjurer's appetite for timing. The Most Haunted House in England in 1940, and after his death in 1948, a second book compiled from his material in 1946, The End of Borley Rectory. In between, a war made ghosts of its own, and the country learned other definitions for dread. Still, readers wanted the Essex house back, wanted the shape of those rooms that held so much concentrated fear. They wanted the nun on the path, the hands in the corridors, the bells that knew names. Price gave it. He set scenes. He notated his strikes and throws, burned notes into memory, invited us into a vigil by candlelight and magnesia flash, watched ink solidify into the only exorcism that would ever stick. He recounted the Foysters' terror, and when it suited his arc, accepted their plight at face value. He put on the page that jawbone dug from the cellar, as if revelation had the weight of bone by default. He gave Marie Lair a grave, and then, as always, came the answerers. In 1956, a trio from the Society for Psychical Research, Eric Dingwall, K.M. Goldney, and Trevor H. Hall, published an investigation that moved like a counterspell. The Haunting of Borley Rectory, a critical survey of the evidence. They dug their own careful trenches in the case. They interviewed. They considered how attention changes a place. They weighed the ways a practiced magician can encourage objects to misbehave. They quoted Marianne Foyster, no longer under the rectory's roof, or her husband's stewardship, admitting to agencies of her own, deceptions staged to cover a personal life. She knew her marriage could not abide tricks to distract, to protect, to take back power in a house that had taken it from her. There is a danger in dismantling mysteries. You can trade one crude story for another. Marianne became, in some accounts, a fabricator entirely, a woman whose needs made a place to perform. In others, she remained a battered witness to a strangeness over her head. The SPR report cast Harry Price in shadow. They suggested he had, at best, made a theater of a family's fear, and at worst, salted the ground for wonders. They pointed out the absent priory of legend, the lack of archival Marie Lair, the ease with which planchettes spell what a room wants to know. But the report, however thorough, did not salt every field. There remained like splinters, accounts from people with nothing to sell, the carpenter's brick, the bell in an empty house, heard by those who did not know the story, yet the little rhythmic pulse of steps under floorboards you could feel with a hand. There remained the unambitious fact that people can sit in an evening light with their tea and a closed book, and then feel their head turn because something has moved in the room that their eyes cannot count. Was it sound? Was it breath? Was it the simple, powerful habit of pattern seeking? The brain stitching a bruise of shadow into a figure because it strains to complete what is partial. In the parish, on earth, grass grew. The stones from the rectory were reused here and there for sheds and walls, as useful as anything when stripped of their story. Along the old hedge line, a walker can still feel the way the ground dives where a foundation once bit. In late October, when mist takes the fields at evening and everything at ankle height turns to silver and suggestion, the path where an apparition had once been given a job, walk, pause, walk, keeps its lean. Sometimes a parishioner, half a century on, will pause there and listen because their grandmother told them to. If they hear nothing, they smile at themselves. If they hear something, the car down the lane, the sudden startle of a bird in the hedge, they file it away and do not say it aloud because telling sets hooks. There are photographs, a dusty window with a smear that, when printed wrong, looks like a face. A blur you can call a brick mid-flight if you want to keep the evening interesting. Cross-referenced reports from observers whose attention was the true medium in that year between war and wreckage. There is a sense, reading the stack, of good faith and mischief and desire braided together so tightly that our tools can't unbraid them without snapping something vital in the rope. Some lessons suggest themselves, even if we refuse them. Houses are not containers for the dead. They are amplifiers for the living. A rectory is a tuning fork pitched to the frequency of belief, with rooms tall enough to carry a human whisper, like a psalm, a marriage like Lionel and Marianne's, placed in those corridors, built to serve other appetites than theirs, buckled under strain. The voices they heard, whether thrown by prank conjured by stress made plausible by empathy, or lifted from the floors by a gallows of physics we have yet to properly name, were then and remain now part of a chorus that swells around old places because we need it to. If you return to Borley today, it is not to a ruin, but to a field. The rectory is a memory underfoot. The flint wall has pieces of its original logic left. The hedge still suggests a shape in air. Somewhere in the local museum, there's a clipping from the Daily Mirror, the screaming welcome of print to a phenomenon that cannot be owned by it. In the churchyard, where Price pressed for a coffin to accept bones that might have been anything's, there is a stone with a name that turns to mist the minute you try to make it human. Marie Lair, the paper says. Yet the soil refuses to admit it. Stories that ask you to choose often teach you more by the discomfort of refusal. If you need the Borley Rectory to have been purely a stage, a trick box, a menagerie of human flaws, then watch how quickly your certainty empties the place of everything that makes it still matter. If you need it to have been a visitation, a moral that punishes or absolves, watch how quickly you decide which woman to sanctify and which to condemn. Neither truth, by itself, will keep the hedges at dusk from moving the small hair at the back of your neck. After the last book, after the last report, after the last nighttime tour of the empty lane, where hooves have had a century to return, and haven to what remains is the image of a woman pausing on a garden path, not looking at you, not asking anything, not even aware that you are there. Just an old trick of light, perhaps, in a place so used to holding a shape, it will keep it whether you admire it or not. The rectory's disaster was not its fire and not its walls coming down. It was the precision with which it taught us the narrowness of our measurements when we stand in old rooms and ask them to be only what we can prove. Across England, other houses have been built and burned and folded back into earth, and not one of them has learned to keep its stories clean. The Borley Rectory did not either. It produced, as if by heat, those people who watch at windows, and those people who walk away, and those who come back years later because something in the air at a specific corner holds them like a hand on a sleeve. You can stand there, if you like, in late autumn, when the light is as thin as an eyelash, and wait for a bell that will not ring. You can leave before dusk. You can read the books again, and choose a side, and find yourself pushing the book away at the same page as last time. Because certainty is not always a comfort. You can go home, lock your door, put the kettle on, and in the small noise of the house settling, hear a light tap in another room, as unthreatening as a question asked by no one. You can go to bed, finally, and if you dream at all, perhaps it will not be of nuns or bells or chalk, but of a corridor that makes you walk a little faster as you go because you do not like to be last.